It is my honor to introduce you all to my good friend Leroy Adams, who is the founder, editor, and executive producer of the Buddy Pass podcast and the Buddy Pass Travel magazine. He does not want me to say journal. That's kind of like an inside joke that we have. It is definitely a travel magazine, and it is a gorgeous piece of art. You can't see it that well over my shoulder, but when I tell you, he does a really good job of curating beautiful images of all types of Black people, light skin, dark skin, gender conforming, non-gender conforming, thin, plus size, all of it. And so he really tries his best to capture the Black experience abroad in a beautiful way that honors, folks in our community across the diaspora, and in particular, those from the United States who decided to travel abroad and even in sometimes around the country. And so it's an honor to introduce my homeboy, Leroy Adams. It is also an honor to have university professor Dr. Mia Bay, who is the author of Traveling Black, who really shares the stories and histories of Black folks fight for the freedom and to just be in our own country, all parts of our own country. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. If you have questions, comments, type them in the chat, and I'm going to turn it over to Leroy to facilitate our conversation for tonight.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Clark. Dr. Bay, as I mentioned, it is such a pleasure and honor to meet you. Oftentimes you hear in our community that the work that my generation is doing, we're standing on the shoulders of those who come before us. And so I truly consider the work that I'm doing with the Buddy Pass magazine and podcast as that I'm standing on the shoulders of you and others who are creating this history or reporting on this history, sharing this history of Black people and travel. And so just really excited to have you here and chat with you. Before we, dive into your book, I wanted to give folks a sense of just how you got here. And that perhaps includes some of your previous work. And so as I was looking at some of the interviews you've done previously, you mentioned that you started your work in a space known as intellectual history. And so I'm curious, talk to us a bit about what is intellectual history and how it has informed Traveling Black.
Thanks for the question. That's a great question, Leroy. And thank you for talking to me tonight. Intellectual history is like the history of ideas, what people are thinking about things, which is sort of what I trained in. And I was in particular interested in African-American ideas, and also sometimes where African-Americans sort of got their ideas from, because a lot of people weren't necessarily all that well educated. I studied, 19th century African Americans, people who didn't necessarily go to school. So I sort of thought about how people spend a lot of time thinking about people's ideas, how they respond to things. And intellectual history is often like you look at texts and you look at people kind of discussing things. But over time, the more I looked at the Black experience, the more I was like, people are actually getting their ideas from like moving through the world, through the things they encounter. And I wrote a biography of the anti-lynching crusader, Ida B. Wells. And I came to think, as I studied her life experience and what she said and wrote about it, that she really became an activist and developed a very, very nuanced critique of the world she lived in, partially just out of the difficulty she had living in the segregated South in the late 19th century. And the experience that first inspired her to write was the experience of being kicked off the train in the 1880s. And it just kind of made her rethink the idea that there was anything such as Southern chivalry, or that, she was kicked out of what was then called a ladies' car. So she was like, this is confusing. Like, I am, in fact, a woman. So why can't I ride in the ladies' car? So she began to think about race, class, and gender at this point. She's a very young woman at this point, and she never stopped after that.
And I'm glad you brought up Ida B. Wells, and you've mentioned her several times in previous interviews as well. One of the things I found interesting was how you said that you found the history of travel segregation quite, and Ida B. Wells being kicked off or thrown off a lady's car sort of sparked your interest in this particular history. Could you talk a bit about where your mind went to when you read about the history or the experience of Ida B. Wells being kicked off a lady's car despite being a lady? Where'd your mind go to?
Well, for one thing, I did not know that there was a system of sort of gender segregation that sort of predates colored cars. Almost not long after they invent railroads, they begin to set aside sort of first class, better cars for women because they're having trouble getting women to ride the trains because they're filled with smoke and men spitting tobacco so they sort of try to create a more sort of sort of comfortable space for women. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. So before there were colored cars, there were ladies' cars. And then in ways that are complicated, the ladies' cars end up becoming the white car because when you start to have middle class Blacks such as Ida B. Wells riding in the ladies' car, that is not something white Southerners are comfortable with. So they kind of move towards a racial segregation as opposed to any kind of gender division. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And what it made me think about was how segregation had to be invented. So I was like, well, I wonder what happened when they got buses, and then why is it the back of the bus? It was the front of the train. So it just sort of denaturalized the whole process for me and made me realize that people had to kind of invent it on the ground in complicated ways. And I decided I wanted to know more about like what happens as you get buses and airplanes and other forms of transportation.
I love that you mentioned, that they had to sort of make this up because as I'm reading your book, there's so much history here, right? It spans across decades, but it also spans across different sectors. Trains, buses, airplanes. And as I'm reading this, and I'm looking at the different mechanisms and techniques of travel segregation, none of it really makes sense. It's like kids are just making up something just to appease white travelers, if you will. And so let's dive into the book, and I'm gonna do my best here because it's so much history here. You talked about travel segregation in trains, cars, and buses. And I want to get all over the place, but for the sake of our audience, I'm going to really try to keep this as neat as possible. And so starting with trains, you open up the book talking about the Jim Crow traveling kit and the origin of the Jim Crow car and what W.E.B. Du Bois described as a form of discomfort and disrespectful travel. Talk to us a bit about the Jim Crow traveling kit and the origin of the Jim Crow traveling car.
Yeah. I mean, what the underlying logic behind segregation, and there's a couple of things that kind of shape it. One is that most forms of transportation, this is true too today as well, tend to have like good seats and worse seats and bad, so wherever the Jim Crow section was the place you actually did not want to travel. And that starts first on the railroad. There was always a kind of a kind of car where you had railroad workers sitting. It was the smoking car. It was at the front of the train at a time when trains crashed a lot. There were all these sort of reasons why you didn't want to sit in a certain part of the train, and that's where the Jim Crow car rode. And the Jim Crow car was typically just the worst place to sit. And this would be the logic that would flow from one form of segregation to the next. Some of the sort of Jim Crow spaces are spaces that maybe we don't think of as that bad today, but the back of the bus back in the day before Springs was not a good place to sit. And likewise, there was for a while a front seat of the plane, which was right by the propeller. So it was partially about, creating a kind of hierarchy within the space, but it was also about separation. And that really had to do with the ways in which after after slavery ends, it was important for whites, especially in the South, to actually impose a racial hierarchy. As long as you had slavery, it was completely clear who was the superior race and who was the inferior race. You kind of assume that all Blacks were either enslaved or akin to enslaved. But once you have emancipation, you have challenges to the racial order, and you have the possibility of whites and Blacks interacting on equal terms in close quarters. And that is the issue around travel, that it's going to put white and Black people together in close quarters. Strangers, where the hierarchy is not clear, and there's a sort of a resentment among some whites that Blacks can even afford to use these forms of transportation, which are, and initially, all of them are initially kind of expensive and for middle class people. So segregation really develops to sustain and maintain the racial hierarchy by sort of making it clear who's superior and who's inferior.
Yeah, you mentioned there's a quote in your book, and I'm hearing it's white people have a distinct aversion to associating with Black people or meeting them in any relation that implies a social equality, even in public conveyances or places. And so you touched on it a bit there, but I'm curious if you go a bit deeper in terms of how does this idea of social equality between Blacks and whites influence separate but not equal, and then you see the not equal in the types of amenities and accommodations that Black travelers are forced to experience?
It is about how, in particular, that Blacks cannot use any kind of first class accommodations. That's what the real focus is often. And the only exception is made is that Blacks who are servants, like nurses, people people with white, people who are taking care of a white child or something like that, they can sit wherever. But all other Blacks can't sort of occupy any kind of prime real estate. They can't sit in the first class car or in a nice car. And one of the reasons why Jim Crow conditions become so substandard is that once it's been established that there's going to be this two-tier system, transportation providers, the railways, later the bus companies, they initially don't really welcome this because it could potentially really cost them money if they had to provide actually separate but equal accommodations. But as this system gets put in place, there's no scrutiny around separate but equal, and the way that the railroads and bus companies make their peace with it is they give African Americans the sort of broken down old railway cars. They have them sitting in the uncomfortable seats in the back of the bus that no one else wants to sit in. It's always about sort of, doing it in a way that doesn't actually require that much from the companies, the carriers that are moving people around.
And you touched on the sort of dangers that existed in the ways that Black people were forced to travel. And what I found quite interesting early on in your book was the dangers of long distance travel. And we'll touch right here on long distance travel by cars, by personally owned cars by Black travelers. And what I gained from this was it wasn't only about segregation and racism, but it was about, like you mentioned, basic human dignity and survival in regards to long distance travel. So what were some of those particular dangers that Black people had to consider when they did travel long distances?
Well, just to start with trains, the problem with trains was this thing of being in the oldest car, because over time, the oldest car on the train would be the only wooden car on the train, because by the 20th century, you begin to have all metal passenger cars. They're behind an all metal locomotive. And then there's the Jim Crow car. So if there were train crashes, often the Jim Crow car would be the car with all the casualties. And this was something that African Americans were aware of and complained about and tried to challenge with state governments, but it never really changed. So there was a series of what came to be known as Jim Crow wrecks during the early 20th century. Actually, the last one was in 1951, where you had big train crashes in which virtually all the injuries are in the Jim Crow cars. So there's that. And then when you get to driving, people are really hoping for a better, sort of safer way of traveling. But African Americans will have trouble when it comes to driving around issues of where they can stop, of where it's safe for them to stop, of where they can where people will sell them gas, people will allow them to sleep, and all these things have their dangers too. Black travelers from this time period, sort of pre-1960s time period, report having to drive for many hours before they can find a hotel where they're allowed to stop. People sometimes carried gasoline in the backs of their cars to avoid gas stations that didn't want to serve Black travelers at all. People carried food. They carried everything they needed. And this was kind of another form of the Jim Crow kit that the guy that I opened my book talks about. It's about, like, you're traveling, but you're not traveling in a world where people are willing to serve you in any way.
It got me to thinking about just the psychology of Black travelers during that time, where you're maybe just trying to travel across country to visit a family member, but you're just so concerned with just getting your family there safely, having to, and you mentioned in your book, having to navigate the inconsistency of laws in different states, some travel laws that make it create a sort of a safer experience for Black travelers to travel to these states, but in other states may be more restrictive. And so the psychology of just navigating all of that and the stress and the emotional distress of Black travelers during that time is really just what popped out to me as I'm reading this, in terms of the dangers that our Black travelers faced in just trying to travel across state lines. One other thing that really came up for me when I'm reading the section around cars, there were apparently people of all nations. I'm curious, could you talk a bit about that? Who were these people of all nations, and what role did they play in the fight for travel freedom?
Well, as you mentioned, it was extremely complicated. Different states have different laws, and they also had different sort of customs. So when it came to people who were non-white, who were traveling, they could get different receptions in different places depending on what the local customs was. Like, for instance, in Texas, where there were a lot of Mexican sharecroppers, Mexicans rode in the colored car, but Chinese people didn't, because I guess there weren't enough Chinese people in Texas for them to have really developed a strong opinion of what color they were.
Yeah.
In California, however, sometimes, when they first developed buses, the Chinese had to have their own bus because they couldn't ride with the white people. Florida, Hispanics did not have to ride in the colored car, and sometimes Black people got out of riding in the colored car by speaking Spanish and acting like they didn't know any English. So it was complicated. It had to do with the sort of local racial hierarchy. Black Americans were kind of the defining person that had to travel in segregation, but other groups sometimes did or sometimes did not. Some groups really fought hard not to be categorized, like Native Americans in parts of the South sort of fought not to fall under Jim Crow laws. But the system never worked perfectly, and when you had travelers from other countries, various people could end up detained for traveling in the wrong space.
Wow. Yeah. Let's transition into cars.
Okay.
What's typically known as a style of travel that is personable, private,
Mhm.
right? It's not that way for Black travelers. So let's talk about how does segregation sort of work its ownership
Mhm.
style of travel. And just real quick before you answer, I'm getting a message that my video is a bit choppy.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna go off video to hopefully that'll help a bit.
Okay. Yeah, so with cars, I mean, cars initially seemed like they would be great. They're private, they're your own car, there's a kind of freedom to the car that a lot of Americans were celebrating. But as cars actually become useful for long distance transportation, and that's with the building of roads and stuff, they also begin to depend on a system of what sociologists call automobility, which is that, you have hotels, roadside accommodations of various kinds, you have gas stations, you have service stations, you have all these things you have to use to keep a car running. And these things became major sites of segregation, major sites of sort of divisions over race and class, and Black people found themselves excluded. They also found themselves sometimes the subject of white hostility for owning cars, for driving cars. When cars are first developed, there's kind of an idea that, this is not going to be anything that Black people are going to get to use or be able to use with any skill. Eventually that passes, but still there is a way in which Black there's an attempt to maintain the hierarchy in cars, and you see it at things like gas stations that some of them will not even sell gas to Black customers. This is because gas stations develop as a kind of way to sell gas to women, because to white women, because gas is initially something you pick up at the hardware store, but as they kind of streamline travel and try to get more women doing it, they make these kind of comfortable gas stations where you have complete service, and they literally talk about how they should be, that you should have flowers, they should look like a cottage, this will be very, it should be homey. And all of this kind of is like this white middle class home. So that is one of the reasons why African Americans are sometimes completely unwelcome in gas stations. And even in the South, even where they can buy gas, they usually cannot use the restroom or eat in whatever kind of food service area there is. So all of this complicates just sort of something very basic about traveling. And then you kind of take this out into hotels, motels, anything else you're going to need. And it means that when African Americans travel, they have to really try to figure out where they can stop. They have to figure it out in advance. A lot of people actually don't stay in hotels. They stay with friends and they sort of plan this, or they stay in like rooming houses, but then they have to make sure there is one. So while most Americans are increasingly moving into a system of driving where people enjoy the open road, and the idea is you just get in the car and kind of when you get tired, you stop at whatever roadside hotel you see. This is not how African Americans travel during the segregation era. Instead, they typically have to plan everything out in advance, and a lot of people kind of drive straight through when they're going somewhere. They just try to sort of minimize their time on the road because they don't want things to go wrong. And there is, of course, also, some stuff that's still familiar to us today, like certain forms of police harassment, a kind of lack of safety on the road.
With I'm glad you touched on that point there. One of the things that comes up, as you notice in the book, is this idea of a racial right of way.
Mm-hmm.
And which you're giggling because it's again, it goes back to your idea of like none of it made sense, and it seems like kids are just making this up as they go to maintain this sort of racial superiority for white people.
Mm-hmm.
And could you talk a bit about this idea of a racial right of way, and how did it impact Black travel by the automobile.
Yeah. The sort of idea of a racial right of way is something I came across researching this book. I actually thought it sounded so crazy that, and the first time I heard about it, I was like, oh, nobody really did that. That's crazy. But there were parts of the Deep South where initially, when you have people beginning to use cars, black and white, deference was so much the norm in terms of what Black people were expected to do in the South, that they sort of toyed with the idea of having things like what you do at a stop sign determined by your race. So that would mean, that the Black person would stop and wait until the white person went. Of course, this did not work on the ground, because the Black driver could have another white driver behind him. What would you do at a four-way stop? I mean, it literally would become like this strange mathematical problem you couldn't figure out. So it kind of collapsed because it didn't make any sense. It just wasn't viable. But there were vestiges of it in the South, customary things like Black drivers weren't supposed to pass white drivers on dusty roads, because, Black male drivers had to be very careful about passing white women in any circumstances. And driving could be just a kind of area, an arena of conflict. The racial right-of-way idea dies down, but what doesn't die down is sort of the fact that many African Americans come to think, especially when driving in the Deep South, that you want to kind of keep your contact with whites to a minimum, which is why many people drive straight through, and they, sometimes drive at night. They just want to kind of not
avoid any interaction with white people, other white travelers.
Yeah,
as a form of safety. It's just this idea of coming to a four-way stop sign, and you're having to figure out which white person you let go first is just so bizarre to me, but to your point, these sorts of systems eventually collapse within themselves because you just can't sustain them, because they literally do not make any sense. There's no foundation to keep them afloat. Yeah. One of the things that I also found quite interesting, particularly in the car section of your book, was the idea around the economic disadvantages of travel segregation. So in the car section of your book, you're talking about now how you have chauffeurs, and this is an opportunity, a great job opportunity to get a job and then create wealth for your family. But Black chauffeurs were denied those opportunities, were denied those jobs. Yeah. Could you share a bit more about? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, initially, there was a tradition in the South that sort of went back to slavery times. And actually became an important way of keeping Blacks out of sort of skilled jobs. It was the idea that Blacks had no mechanical aptitude. So when you first get the car, you have literally people predicting that that the Black coachman, because at that time Black wealthy people hired Black coachmen to drive them around in their horse and buggy. The idea is that this Black coachman would be replaced by a white chauffeur, because Black men couldn't possibly drive. And for a while, this is what you have white chauffeurs, and the white chauffeurs actually, when they do see any Black person driving or getting a job as a chauffeur, they really actually try to keep Black men out of this field, because they're kind of protecting it as white work. But during the World War I period, this kind of collapses when there's a manpower shortage. You begin to have more Black drivers, more Black men learn how to drive, and cars also become like super easy to use. So increasingly, nobody wants to pay someone to like a full-time chauffeur to do everything. They prefer to hire actually Black men who they can also ask to do the gardening and other things. So eventually chauffeuring becomes Black work, but initially it is sort of something that white men claim for themselves.
Transitioning here a bit to the buses section, and typically when we think about travel segregation in regards to buses, Rosa Parks always comes up.
Yeah.
So many other examples and that you presented here in your book, and one of the things that really stood out to me was the different types of technique mechanisms that were used by buses, but the bus industry again maintain this idea of racial superiority. The special ticketing system is one of the things that just jumped out to me, where buses would make sure that Black travelers got a specific ticket that denoted a seat in the back of the bus. As you were conducting your research and writing your book, which I believe you mentioned in a previous interview, it took you about 10 years to write this book. My gosh, the patience and dedication, first of all. Let me give you your flowers for that. When you were conducting this research, what other types of techniques to maintain racial superiority surprised you?
What surprised me, I mean, there was something that I discovered, in every chapter that really surprised me. Actually, a lot of the stuff about buses surprised me. The places where Blacks were assigned these special tickets, they were in the North, where there was no legal bus
Really?
of any kind. It was done so that they could put people in the back of the bus right in New York or Philadelphia, and they wouldn't have to move them later. That's why they assigned them special seats, because if people weren't assigned special seats, they had to move everyone on the bus. When you got to, usually DC was a big change point, and that was a pain in the ass. And so that was one of the many things surprised me, is that you often had northern segregation occurring in the northern states, sometimes because as a matter of convenience, sometimes as a matter of kind of commitment on the part of the carriers, but it was quite common. And I sort of found all these things by researching, looking at complaints that people wrote to the NAACP, what people talked about in the newspapers, people's memoirs, and it's just, people left such a rich record of all this. And a lot of it was surprising. I mean, I was surprised also to find that there was various forms of seat segregation on planes, which nobody had ever written about, as well as some outright exclusion of Black travelers on planes. So there's just so many sort of surprising things, or things we have forgotten about, that occur around travel discrimination for much of our history.
And you mentioned the NAACP, and one of the things you also noted in your book was that the fight for travel freedom and travel equality sort of was the start of the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
Could you share? Yeah,
it's just a long running thread. It's Plessy versus Ferguson, the famous case in which the legal doctrine, separate but equal, was established, was a railroad case. People often forget that, but it was a case brought by Homer Plessy, who was a Black man in Louisiana, and the case was brought to challenge what was called the separate car laws in the South, in Louisiana and other places, to challenge whether they were constitutional or not. It reflected the ways in which travel was a really central site for the sort of invention of segregation. And then when you look at civil rights, what you see is African Americans fighting segregated transportation almost continuously, from the era of Plessy v. Ferguson on through the Montgomery bus boycott and the freedom rides. And so often what people are actually fighting about is their experiences traveling. So that was sort of the thread that my book ended up following.
Why do you think that the fight for travel equality, at least from what I was able to gather through your book, sort of took a backseat to other areas of civil rights for Black people.
I don't know that it took a back seat. I know that, like, for instance, organizations like the NAACP, other Black civil rights organizations, always had a giant agenda and had to kind of prioritize. So there were certainly points at which the NAACP was not doing as much about travel as it wanted to because of budgetary reasons, like during the Depression era, when the NAACP loses a lot of the money that it has, they kind of decide they're going to focus on education and sort of drop their travel campaign. The NAACP always also has to sort of worry about lynching, violence against Black people, so they have to prioritize. So travel sometimes is not the first thing on the agenda. It often comes second to anti-Black violence, education, voting. Yet at the same time, the NAACP and other civil rights organizations have to deal with travel because it continues to be a problem. You have individual Black travelers who will launch their own lawsuits, who will file complaints. It's just something that is, something that people find intolerable. And I think the reason why people found Jim Crow travel so intolerable was, as you noted, it made no sense. It was a set of rules that you couldn't easily follow, and even if you wanted to, so people would try to travel and not get into trouble, but they wouldn't always be successful.
Even in picking up, I wanted to touch on one thing in regards to the Jim Crow card. I'm glad you mentioned that really quickly here, because I found it interesting that there were civil rights leaders, and I'm going to mention Booker T. Washington here, who talked about, he didn't condemn the idea of separation, but it was the inadequacy of accommodations. So it seemed like there was, so I'm going to use the word division here for the sake of this conversation on what should we focus on specifically for travel rights. Is it travel equality, or is it the equal accommodations? And it just seemed to be like we couldn't sort of come together on what it is we should be fighting about in regards to travel freedom and travel rights.
Well, yeah, and that had to do with the fact that there were divisions among Black leaders about the extent to which you push back against segregation per se. Like Booker T. Washington, was fine with Black schools. He promised, white Americans that Blacks and whites could remain separate and work together. But even someone like him, or let's say someone like Marcus Garvey, who actually believes in Black separatism, when it came to travel, couldn't help but noticing that traveling Jim Crow wasn't just separate. It was profoundly unequal. But
Unequal.
Yeah, and by the time they were traveling, the Jim Crow car and the sort of the white car were the same. They cost the same, even though the Jim Crow car was the car that used to be this, the second class car or the third class car, and still was. They actually, Blacks paid the same amount of money to travel in like a wooden car with no air conditioning on a train that held, state-of-the-art metal passenger cars with air conditioning for whites.
It seems to me also that one of the sort of impediments, if you will, to progress in regard to travel rights was, one, the deference to white people, white travelers, and this belief with white people that in order for Black people to progress, they had to give something up. And so as you're writing this book, do you find instances of that sort of white psychology that we don't want Black equality because that means we have to give something up, which in reality, we both know that's not necessarily true?
Yeah, though, I mean, I guess, part of what these distinctions did give white people was a sense of white privilege and white superiority, which
Mm,
they valued,
mm,
just a sense that they would always get the best of everything.
mm,
Um, and and they wanted, it seems like part of the idea, and businesses kind of took this up, was they, businesses go along with this for a variety of reasons, but one is that they think that it's what the white consumers want.
mm.
And they
It's a
worry
business.
about desegregating, when the time comes, when the protests sort of begin to force them to it. A lot of, they have these sort of meetings in southern towns because no business wants to desegregate until all the other businesses do, because
So
they don't want to become the business that people are
the first one to do it.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No one wants to be the first.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's transition here into airplanes, and I also added the idea of cultural representation as well to airplanes, and the reason I added that, as you know, I published the Buddy Pass Travel magazine,
Mhm.
and for the most part, we focus on the international travel of Black people today.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I find shocking, even in the travel industry today, particularly international travel, is that 54% of Black travelers will tell you that if they see themselves in travel advertising or marketing, they're more likely to go to a destination. And so the travel industry is really struggling,
Mhm.
horribly so, to market and speak to Black travelers today. And obviously the airline industry is right sort of in the center of that.
Mhm.
And so could you share a bit about what is the history of racial segregation as it pertains to the airline industry?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. There was never any kind of laws requiring segregation in the air. Segregation in the air would actually sort of be illegal in the sense that most airline transportation is interstate, and the sort of Plessy versus Ferguson decision, at least formally, applies to travel within a state. But the fact is that in the early days of air transportation, there were not that many Black travelers, and there was some initial resistance to even seating Black travelers. And once it became clear that airlines could not refuse Black travelers because any kind of what's called a common carrier, any kind of form of transportation you can buy a ticket for, is supposed, if it serves the public, is supposed to serve everyone.
Mhm.
They realized they had to seat Black travelers, but they would try to seat them separately. Early on in the first seat of the plane, there used to be a sort of really bad seat by the propeller, and then subsequently they would try to put all Black passengers in the same row by assigning them, again, a kind of special notation on the
Mm.
ticket. My mother actually experienced this in the 1950s. Once I asked her
Oh my gosh.
the first flight, because she's a real fraidy cat, so I thought she was going to be like, it was terrifying. Like, and instead she said, there was only one other Black person on the plane, and I sat beside him, and I thought it was an incredible coincidence. And later I learned it wasn't a coincidence at all. That
Oh my gosh.
like if they saw you when they bought the ticket, or if they knew what neighborhood you came from, they assigned you to a special seat. If they hadn't assigned you to a special seat, they moved you when you got to the plane.
Dr. Bay, you said 1950s.
1950s.
That's not that long ago.
No.
That
No,
that that's not that long ago. And again,
it's not long ago. Yeah.
when I was reading your book, I actually took a picture of a page that had, it was a white owned business that said, we only serve Black travelers. I believe it was, white travelers.
Mm-hmm.
And it was less than 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And
No,
I
that
think
isn't that long ago.
it was not that long ago. And we often have these conversations around uh, uh, the civil rights struggle and any facet. And we tend to think of it 300, 400, 500 years ago. but some of the things you're teaching us in your book are less than 100 years ago. You know, and so that's just mind-boggling to me. And you know, so I am now, you know, sticking with the airlines. I'm at a point now where I don't even know if I want to travel with American Airlines anymore because I'm reading your book, and you know, you talk about how American Airlines didn't hire their first reservation clerk until 1955. Or again, you know, you mentioned it, that and to identify those Black travelers, they would tell their callers if anyone sounded Black or if they had an address in a Black neighborhood, then that would influence the ticket that they were given on the plane. And so what came up for me was in the Black community, we have this idea around travel that Black people don't travel to certain places, or Black people don't travel certain types of ways. And so my question to you is, when we have these ideas about ourselves, the historical context is often not considered. And so, you know, my question to you, how has this sort of segregation, the examples I've just given about American Airlines, how do you feel it's influenced the ideas we as Black people have about the way we travel?
I mean, I think, you know, there's, you know, when I talk about this with, you know, audiences who are older, a lot of people remember a lot of this stuff. So it's not a long time ago. And there is actually sociological data by people who study travel showing that Blacks are less likely to travel for anything other than sort of seeing family and going to funerals and stuff, and less likely to do recreational travel as a group than others. And, you know, recently, as you mentioned, there's been a Black travel movement, but you know, the way that African Americans travel, I think, is still different. You still have people checking to see, you know, whether this is a good place for Blacks to go. To find out what other people's experiences were, that kind of thing. The internet has made some of that easier, but I think Black people to this day travel more cautiously, with more kind of forethought about what's going to happen, with more worries about things going badly, you know, than other people. I think that continues to be part of the Black experience, and, you know, maybe a certain less joy in sort of travel, less freedom in it.
You know, I shared with you before we jumped on the call that I'm here in Fort Lauderdale at a Sea Trade cruise travel conference. And yesterday I was in a session where there was the marketing directors for Disney Cruise Line and Carnival Cruise Line. And they were talking about how they market to cruisers, multi-generational family travelers. And they were talking about how within their marketing campaigns, they really try to make people feel welcomed and like family on their cruises. And so, Dr. Bay, I'm sorry, I had to stand up and I said, I got a question for you all. There's a recent study that came out that said 70% of Black travelers consider safety as their primary concern when they travel, whether that be planes or cruises. And so I asked these marketing directors of these major cruise corporations, I said, how are you marketing to Black families and Black travelers to also make them feel safe and welcomed on your cruises, considering recently there was a Black man who was on a Carnival cruise, I believe it was, and he was called the N-word. And when he raised a complaint about it, the police came and actually escorted him away. And then another instance, there was a young lady, young Black girl, who had her hair touched on a cruise ship, and her mother complained, and of course nothing was done. And so the response that I got back, even today in 2023, that I got back from these executives was, you know, we try to make everyone feel safe, and we try to make everyone feel welcomed. And we use, and I kid you not, this is what they said to me, we use Shaq in our marketing campaigns. I'm not even sure, Dr. Bay, I'm not even sure what that had to do with anything. But it's so interesting, even today, these corporations that have this history of travel discrimination in regards to Black people, they're still struggling with it today.
Yeah, they are.
You know, I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I often reflect on the fact that travel, we live in a society where there's some illusion of like a class, the illusion that class doesn't matter, maybe, and when you travel, especially like when you fly, it's the most visibly classed experience you ever have. Like you get on the plane in the order of how much you paid for your ticket, basically. And when you haven't paid a lot, you're like, oh my gosh, I'll never get on this plane. But there's a big intersection between class and race in our country. So Blacks are still not the target customer for like a lot of travel marketers and travel companies. And there's still a way in which there's sort of stereotypes where African Americans are thought not to be likely to be in the first class. So I'm not surprised, like the cruise companies hire Shaq to sort of promote it.
I'm so sorry.
They're not all that serious, think about any of it.
No, and it seems that the onus tends to go back on us as Black people to address some of these experiences that we are having, which is quite unfortunate. Wrapping it up, you close your book, the epilogue, with hashtag Black Travel Matters. And I wanted to just read sort of an excerpt before I ask my last question here. You open it up with a gentleman by the name of John LeFleur, and he talks about looking back on his life in 1974. He says he wondered whether these memories meant anything to younger Blacks, and he's talking about travel segregation. The struggle for change had extended across different eras in ways that young Blacks who have just come on the scene do not fully appreciate because they didn't know anything about it being denied. They took their access to ordinary everyday travel amenities for granted. They never worried about toilet service or food. They don't know anything about having to go around in the back door to get a hamburger if you got one at all. And they certainly knew nothing about riding up in a Jim Crow coach where sinners would pour in on you because there was no screens to your windows. They don't know anything about sitting over the hot motor of an inner city bus. That was the only seat you could occupy. There are so many things that they don't know anything about. And so my question to you is, because it seems that there's a concern here for him that younger travelers, the next generation, won't appreciate how far we've come in terms of our rights to travel as Black people. So what is your hope for this book and educating my generation about how far we've come for our fight for travel freedom?
Well, one of the things I really wanted to do with the book was record the old system, because the old system was a system of practices, not just laws. So just like, some of this stuff was not written down anywhere. People who experienced knew about it, but some people who hadn't experienced it were thinking separate but equal in travel might have meant separate but equal. So I wanted people to be aware of that. But I also started working on this book around the time of Hurricane Katrina, where those images of Black people stuck in the Superdome, Black people left behind in New Orleans, kind of shocked the country, and, certainly made me very much aware that there are impediments to Black mobility today. So that's it, and ones that people are not, people who don't experience them aren't aware enough. So I wanted people to really think about the way people move through the world, and the way that some people have more freedom and safety and security than others in moving through the world. Some people are more likely to be welcome in many spots than others. I think, we can't ignore that. And, the battle for transportation equality is not over yet.
You mentioned Katrina and the Superdome. Could you
Mhm.
expand on that a bit more? How does that sort of play into travel segregation?
Well, you know, one of the early pieces of this book I kind of, or an essay related to this book, was just an essay about why, why African Americans, why everyone who ended, so many people who end up stuck behind in New Orleans are African Americans. And that's all about the fact that African Americans are less likely than whites to own cars and experience many disadvantages when it comes to car ownership. African Americans often have to pay more for their cars, have more difficulty getting credit, have just sort of many impediments to being car owners. And one of the striking things about New Orleans at the time of Hurricane Katrina is that the city didn't even have an evacuation plan for people who didn't own cars. It was just like, if you don't own a car, find a friend who has a car. And, like, if you ever lived in the inner city, if you don't own a car, chances are your neighbors don't either. So,
Yeah.
so it was, we have to think about these inequalities in our world today.
I'll say two more things here, and before we open up to the audience for questions. One, Dr. Bay, thank you for mentioning the gas station and the fact that there was a time where we couldn't even get gas. And the reason I'm thanking you for that is because my girlfriend hates to pump her own gas, and I have to do that. And so now I'm gonna let her know there was a time where you couldn't do that. So take advantage of the freedoms you
Okay,
have
and
today.
you all need to move to Jersey where there's no pumping gas.
Oh my gosh. And the last thing, before we open up to the audience, again, I mentioned there's so much history coming out around Black travel and travel mobility for Black people. And it seems to coincide with this time right now with Black Travel Matters and the Black travel movement. What do you think that's a coincidence? Like, why do you think that is?
Well, I think the Black travel movement and Black Travel Matter, has Black folks talking about the difficulties people still face and sort of thinking about, what it, what travel can be for Black people, trying to make it better. So maybe that also has people looking at the past.
Awesome. Dr. Bate, thank you so much just for the work that you're doing. A beautiful book. I encourage everyone to make sure that they grab a copy. So much to soak up here and learn and then share within our community. And also I can encourage more Black people to just travel. Obviously, there's a history of us being denied that opportunity. And so any form of travel, I encourage all of us to do. And so, now I'd like to open it up. Links, Dr. Clark, we open up to the audience for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Leroy, for facilitating, and Dr. Bay for being open to conversation with Leroy. I wanna address Mike's question in the chat. He said, Dr. Bay, how would you compare the Black travel experience today by car to traveling Black in the 1950s, which he put is the golden age of road tripping? So what's your sense of the comparison? I know you kind of hinted on that, but if you could add a little bit more.
It's definitely improved. I mean, even the creation of the interstate was helpful to Black travelers because it kind of gave a sort of standardized road system in places where you weren't sort of at the mercy of like very local mores. In the 1950s, what to give you in the way of an example, people, even as late as the 60s, Black travelers just had so many challenges around finding places to stay, places to eat. President Lyndon B. Johnson once told this story about, he asked his one of his employees, like his longtime White House employee who was Black, if when they drove to Texas, because the family and some of the employees were going to Texas for the summer, could this black couple take the Johnson's dog in their car with them? And the guy was like, no. And Johnson was like, why? You like the dog. You take care of the dog. And he was like, we have enough trouble finding places to stop and stay on the road just by ourselves. We cannot travel with a dog. So like, this is the 60s. Like, it was just like people had trouble finding places to stay.
So thank you for that. Those of you who are with us today, if you have any more questions, you can type them in the chat. And to give you all some time maybe to ask, I'm going to add a few comments, and then if not, we'll close out. So Dr. Bay, number one, I have a lot of historians on the show, and I think I do that for my own therapy because I'm a millennial. And as Leroy asked the question about oftentimes being blinded to and maybe not appreciating as much as what our elders have gone through, I think Carla Broaddus, who's here, and Dr. Grant, who's here, they both know. I'd be like, yo, where the elders at? What are they doing? Like, but some of that is rooted in the experiences that we had. And so thank you for writing this history and keeping this history, because it's important for us, even the way that I deal with my elders and not being judgmental of them, but a bit more understanding in my approach. The question I have is what are your favorite moments of resistance that you chronicle in the story, or maybe some that you didn't put in there, maybe you found out a little bit later? How do you like what were a few of those moments where you're like, man, that Black person stood up, these Black folks did something collectively and organized in a way that you really appreciated?
That's hard to say because resistance was often so dangerous. So I'm like thinking about like the freedom rides, the people, to start very early on, Frederick Douglass really did not like moving into the colored car. My favorite moment is that once they came to move him into the colored car in Massachusetts, and Frederick Douglass, he was a really strong man, he was a big man. Yeah, he held on to the seats of his seat so hard that they actually had to take a row of seats with them to move the colored car. Yeah.
Yo, I didn't know. I had no idea that. I mean, you see his jaw and his face, you kind of like think like Frederick was a strong man, but you never know from the picture. So I appreciate you sharing that. Leroy said he has one more question that he wants to ask. So Leroy, go ahead.
I do, and thank you, Dr. Clark, for talking about other Black historians who are doing similar work as Dr. Bay. And my question for you, Dr. Bay, again, I'm reading your book and I'm reading the other books around travel segregation, and it's heavy. There are so many painful stories here. How do you, as someone who's studying Black history, and you're coming face to face with these painful stories, daily, how do you heal yourself and protect your mental health and just keep yourself, I don't know, encouraged?
I think of these stories as testimony, because what was really striking to me is that, people recorded these things and they recorded them in detail. And, even back when there was nothing that could be done, or they weren't sure they would write the NAACP and just be like, this is what happened to me. And the letters would go on and on. And people would write about things in their memoirs. So I kind of think about like the ancestors speaking to us, like we need to heed them. So that rather than sort of just thinking of it as, purely the negative, I think it's just like about really understanding the past. And also, appreciating the courage of the people who moved through the world. I mean, because the other thing I would sometimes think is, I'm surprised Black people went anywhere. I mean, this is the era of the Great Migration. It's like, like I would be like, oh my God, I can't get on. I can't deal with this. So, the courage that people had to kind of do all the moving that they did, even though it was really hard to travel.
You mentioned the ancestors. I had to come on video when you mentioned the ancestors.
Yeah, he did. He turned that thing real.
And that Black people, we've been keeping receipts.
Right. The ancestors were keeping receipts.
Receipts.
And you know what, Dr. Bay, listen, when you said the Great Migration, like, think about that. Like, this book provides so much more context for how dangerous it was for Black folks from Alabama and Mississippi to go to like Harlem, to go to Chicago, to go to California. And so I thank you again for like curating that and keeping the receipts of the ancestors. And I'm gonna ask one last question and then we're gonna wrap up and I'm gonna let you go. Cause I know I think you had class tonight, didn't you?
Yeah.
So I know you tired, I know you're ready to be done. So if you had to write one last chapter of the book, what would that chapter be? What would that extra last oomph be in the book that maybe you would put in?
Well, I don't know if it would be like I don't know if it would be an oomph, but part of me, I didn't write about boats, and I could have written about boats, but I didn't write about international travel for a variety of reasons. It just would have made the book too long, but if I ever return to the subject, I will be writing about boats.
Okay, all right. All right, everyone. Dr. Bay, thank you much. Leroy, thank you as well. I'm going to ask the rest of you to stay on as I talk about what we have coming up next for Entrepreneurial Appetite. Dr. Bay and Leroy, you all are welcome to stay, but you're also welcome to go because I know y'all got stuff to do. But those of you in the audience, just bear with me for 2 seconds. I'm going to share my screen again and tell you what we got coming up next. Those of you who are here in San Antonio, you're going to like this because we have a live event next Tuesday about the Alamo. So,
Dr. Bay, thank you so much. Such a pleasure. Dr. Clark.
Pleasure, yes.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Leroy, I appreciate you coming through. So on Tuesday at the Whitty Museum, I am partnering with SACAM, San Antonio's Black History Museum, to present a conversation with Mario Salas, one of our local elders here in San Antonio, who is writing about, who's going to be talking about his book, The Alamo, Cradle of Lies, Slavery and White Supremacy. And so the in-person ticket for that is $65, which includes the book and food. So even though it may look a little pricey, it's actually a really good deal when you consider you're going to get fed. And the book is like super thick. It's $500 pages long. So there's some good information in that. And for those of you who want to join virtually, it's $15. And again, that goes to help us support a local Black-owned business. I think about that in terms of institutions, so we will be supporting SACAM with that effort as well. And also for next month's virtual conversation, I'm going to be featuring Dr. Kelly Richmond Pope, who's the author of Fool Me Once, which talks about in this day and age, you all know, with the internet and scams and all of that stuff, how we can protect ourselves from the fraud industry. And this conversation is going to be very special to me because for those of you who were here at the beginning, you all know that Entrepreneurial Appetite also supports an endowment that I started at my alma mater, North Carolina A&T State University, my HBCU, where Dr. Pope is also a graduate. And so it'll be a good opportunity to showcase some of the good work that A&T has done to produce some really dynamic folks, but then also to support our alma mater. So thank you all much for joining us.